Good afternoon. Cantata 37 is for the Feast of the Ascension that happens 40 days after Easter, and it commemorates Jesus' appearance to his disciples and then his being taken bodily up into heaven in their sight. The gospel reading for the day comes from the very last verses of Mark's book. It consists of Jesus' words to his disciples, and the central passage is the one set in our cantata's first movement. Whoever does have faith and is baptized, he will become blessed with eternal salvation. Now, this was a key text for Martin Luther, who wrote that this might be the greatest sermon ever written in just a few words. It is, in fact, a fundamental text for Lutheran belief in salvation, that is, release from original sin in Lutheran theology, is salvation through faith. And you certainly do not even need to be Michael Morrison or any other scholar of this repertory to see that in the libretto, the opening movement, whoever does believe. The aria number 2, faith is the pledge of love. The aria number 5, faith provides the wings of the soul. And it ends with it even ends with a paraphrase of our gospel text. And then the concluding chorale asks, "Grant me faith." The aria number 2 and the second aria and the following, the aria number 2 and the chorale that follow it, so that is movements 2 and 3, interpret faith as a gift, a love gift, and invokes a marriage metaphor. The chorale that we hear in that third movement is called in its original print, and in almost every hymnal of the time, is called a wedding song for a metaphorical wedding within Lutheran theology. The essential theological moment of this piece is actually in the one accompanied recitative, movement 4, and it has the archetypal Lutheran warning that good deeds are no path to salvation. Only faith is. And the seriousness of this message is emphasized by the string accompaniment and the placing of this in a bass voice. There are in this cantata 2 characteristically contrasting arias, one for a high voice, one for low, one in a major key, one minor, one with a solo obbligato, the other with ensemble instrumental scoring, one that emphasizes musical spinning out, the other in regular phrasing. There are 2 chorale stanzas set to music in this libretto as well. One a simple vocal setting with doubling instruments, that's at the very end, and the other, of course, number 3, for 2 voices and basso continuo. And that piece harkens back, at least at its opening, to 17th century settings. The chorale tune is shared between soprano and alto, but the relationship between them is constantly changing. And by the end of the piece, it's one ecstatic outpouring of joy in response to the message of joy, the nuptial joy described in the text. There is the usual even distribution of solo duties in this cantata, an aria for tenor, an aria for bass, a chorale for soprano and alto, plus that one recitative for bass, but solo duties for each of the 4 voices. The opening scriptural movement of this piece depends entirely on that long and beautiful opening instrumental ritornello, what the voices sing. They just sing the ritornello back while the instruments play it as well. The triple meter and the rhythmic figures that appear in it point to the affect of joy. The voices are mostly used not imitatively, but mostly as a loose block moving together. Okay, so much for the basics. All right, that's the kind of short version of the talk I usually give about these pieces. I want to focus on something else today. The world of stand-up comedy has a great term, one I love. It's the idea of a long walk. And a long walk means the extended setup you might do to get finally to a punchline and a laugh. And today I want to take a kind of a long walk to explain the note in your program on movement 2. It says reconstruction. I want to talk about that in particular, but it's a chance to explain how Bach put a cantata performance together. And it's a chance to talk about what we do in here, how we know what we know about Bach's own performances, and things we don't know to a certain extent. It's going to be a long walk, but I think we're going to find it worthwhile. Right? So that long walk starts with Bach's death in 1750. and the division of his musical estate, the music he left when he died. The church music that he left behind, the materials for that, went to his heirs who was thought could make use of them. To Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, his oldest son, who had a church job in Halle that included presenting cantatas. To Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, his second oldest son, who was working in Berlin as a harpsichordist but aspired to a church position, and very soon after got the best one in all of Germany, really, in Hamburg, the equivalent of his father's position in the other wealthiest German city. To Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son, presumably thought to be headed in that direction, and one of the next youngest sons, Johann Christian Friedrich Bach, as well. And some materials went to Anna Magdalena Bach, the widow, who immediately sold her materials to the Thomasschule, evidently by prearrangement. It was a source of support in an age, of course, without a pension system. So what materials were there to be inherited? For the cantatas, there were Bach's autograph score, and there were the manuscript performing parts from which the singer sang and the instrumentalist played. The existence of both score and parts for each piece meant that two people could inherit each cantata. One got the score, and the other one got the parts. So if you inherited the score and wanted to perform the piece, you could do so by copying out a set of parts. If you inherited the parts and wanted to perform the piece, you could do so by performing the piece, because you don't actually need a score to perform a piece, right? You just put the parts down. You could, of course, make a score from the parts if that's what you thought you needed and wanted. And they were distributed to heirs in this way, scores to one person, parts to the other, by annual cycle, by a cycle of cantatas that got one entirely through the church year. But not all the scores to one person and all the parts to another, they alternated. So you might get the score to one piece, and then the parts to the following week's piece, and then you'd get score and parts and score and parts. So that if you were planning to use these pieces, say every week, it was only every other week that you had to go through the substantial labor of copying out parts. Now I want to back up from the distribution of these materials to the creation of these pieces in the first place. We, of course, this year, in 2023, are marking the 300th anniversary of Bach's arrival in the summer in Leipzig to take up his new job, and thus the 300th anniversary of the performance, and in many cases the composition, of the Leipzig church cantatas that form so much of the repertory of the Bloomington Bach Cantata Project. So, there was an established process by which cantatas were produced and put on, an established process handled by what became a well-oiled machine. So, first step, Bach composed the cantata, producing a score. He composed directly onto the page. There was almost no sketching or drafting. He conceived these pieces and was able to put them down with some corrections and revisions as he went along, but directly onto the page. That score was then handed to a senior assistant who served as the principal copyist for parts. And from the score, that principal copyist extracted vocal and instrumental parts. Extracted in the sense that you would follow along that line of the score, page by page, copying that into a part. And then you'd go back and start again for another part. That's the sense in which parts are said to be extracted. For voices, that copyist made one copy each of soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and each contained all the music in that voice's range. So for today's piece, the soprano part has the soprano line of the chorus number 1, it has the soprano line of the duet chorale setting number 3, and the soprano line of the chorale number 6. All of the other movements in between are accounted for. They say aria tacit or recit and aria tacit, meaning you don't have anything to sing in that. And a part looked something like this. I printed this off. There is a site online, Bach Digital, Bach Digital, in which there are beautiful online pictures of almost all the surviving Bach sources. So I just printed this out. The originals are actually a little bigger. The originals are actually more like that. And this is what the soprano looked like. 2 sides of one page, and it starts with the opening chorus here, and then the soprano line here of that chorale. And you can see it gets very florid by the end, as we described, and then the notes and words of that concluding chorale. And this is what was handed to the soprano, and this is what the soprano sang from. And there was a similar part made for alto, tenor, and bass. That principal copyist also made instrumental parts. For today's piece, that copyist made a part for oboe 1, for oboe 2, for violin 1, violin 2, and for viola. And also parts for the basso continuo players. For this work, one for a string player and one for an organist. And the organ part often will have additional notations to allow the playing of improvised harmonies from that part, so-called figured bass. Each part includes the movement that that instrument plays in and the indication tacit for all the others. So that accounts for all the musical lines in this piece, those parts I've listed. If there were other instruments, there'd be parts for them, parts for trumpets, for drums, for flutes, for records, whatever other instruments might be called for, each one would get their own part. But with the copying of those parts, the process wasn't yet finished, because the principal copyist then enlisted the help of an assistant. A junior copyist, usually somebody much less experienced, learning to do this kind of copying task. And that person made duplicate copies, second copies of 3 parts, of violin 1, of violin 2, and of the basso continuo. Now, if you think about it, this is actually a much easier task. These could be made, and they were made, you can actually document this, from the part that the principal copyist had also already extracted from the score. It was a much simpler job because you could figure out, you didn't have to figure out which line in the score to copy, and you didn't have to figure out how to lay out the line on a page for the part. You just made a duplicate. Why, every time, did they make duplicate copies of violin 1, violin 2, and basso continuo? Well, the answer was really pretty clear. It was so you could have more players on those lines than if you just had one copy. Now, the evidence is actually very strong that almost without exception, these parts, these instrumental parts, and the vocal parts too, were meant to be used by one player each. One oboist would play from an oboe part, one violist would play from a viola part, one violinist from a violin part, and so on. So the existence of 2 copies of the violin 1 part means that there were 2 players on that line, same for violin 2. The 2 basso continuo parts, the 2 copies, were almost always intended, one for cello and one for violone, or double bass. And these same principles apply to the voices as well, by the way. There's actually a complication, of course, as there always is in these pop sources, in respect to this piece. Most of the parts that were made in 1724 when this piece was first performed clearly became unavailable to Bach at some point, most but not all of them. And so he had a replacement set made in 1731. That's what's actually online. But this set we know from lots and lots of other examples would have been made in 1724. The best guess is he may have lent this piece to somebody, retaining a few of the parts for himself, and didn't get it back and said, okay, well, I want to do the piece anyway. And so had another set of copies. Okay. All right. Okay, how does this relate to our cantata and to movement 2? I told you there's a long walk, right? But we'll get there. The surviving material for this piece: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. These are each the parts that survive. They're in Berlin now. Soprano, alto, tenor, bass, oboe 1, oboe 2, violin 1, violin 2, viola, basso continuo, and organ. So from that list, what's missing? Well, what's missing are the duplicates. The second violin 1, the second violin 2, and the duplicate basso continuo part. So what we have is a full principal set, but missing the duplicates. Now, that relates to a detail of the division of Bach's estate that I didn't confuse you with a few minutes ago. When the cantata was split between 2 airs, the parts went to one person and it was scored to another, but not exactly. The parts went to one person, and the other person got the score and the duplicate parts. And if you think about it, that gave you a terrific head start on copying parts for performing the cantata. Because the 3 biggest parts, the 3 longest parts, the one with the most notes in any cantata are always violin 1, violin 2, and continuo. And if you've already got those made, you're in a really good position, right? It reduces the copying labor. So the division act is actually score and duplicate parts to one person, and the rest of the parts without duplicates to the others. This walk is getting longer. So that's what happened with our cantata, with Cantata 37. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach inherited the main set of parts. Who got the score and the duplicates? We don't know. They are lost. There is no trace of them. We have only that set that Philipp Emanuel Bach inherited. there are some consequences to this loss. First of all, the parts are our only source for this piece. Now that's not necessarily a problem. You can make a score, but there is an issue for this cantata in particular. Okay, now think back to the scoring of the aria number 2 that we heard played and sung so beautifully. It's a tenor aria. The vocal line is unsurprisingly written into the tenor vocal part. If I had that tenor vocal part, the equivalent of the soprano here to hold up, you'd find the notes and words of that aria in that part, right? All the other vocal parts say tacit at that movement. What else does that movement need? Well, it needs basso continuo, like every movement. The bass line is in the basso continuo part and the organ part survive. But what's really odd is that if you look at all the other instrumental parts, oboe 1 says tacit, and oboe 2 says tacit, and violin 1 says tacit, and violin 2 says tacit, and viola says tacit. So just voice and continuo. Now there are such pieces in the world for just voice and continuo. Movement number 3 of our cantata, the one for soprano and alto, is one of those. But that kind of piece has a bass line that serves both as tuneful instrumental material, as tuneful ritornello, and as harmonic support. Number 2 starts with a very, let's call it functional bass line, right? It does its bass line job of supporting the harmonies and giving rhythmic drive and so on, and just beautifully played as we heard it. But it's not the kind of ritornello you'd expect, it's not the material you'd expect in one of these voice and continuo only arias. There's clearly something missing from this piece. If we were to play the piece, the opening of the piece that way, you'd wonder why we were leaving something out, because your ear would tell you there is something missing here. So what's missing is a so-called obbligato line for an instrument that plays the ritornello at the opening with the basso continuo, and then we'll insert that ritornello in various places in the piece, or sometimes play along with the voice. So in our aria number 2, what instrument played that ritornello? What played the obbligato line? Well, we can just look at Bach's score, right? From which that line was copied. The score is lost. We don't have it. Okay, now what? First, we've got to figure out what happened here, and then I'm going to see if we can propose a solution to it. What happened? Well, I told you that the regular practice was to make duplicates of violin 1 and violin 2, but that was, as usual, when I give talking here, is not precisely correct. You didn't always make an exact duplicate. In a few pieces, in a few cantatas, those weren't precise duplicates. The best example would be an aria with a solo violin obbligato, where one violinist plays, usually the first player of violin 1 plays, while the other violinists are silent. How would you put that in the parts? Well, the solo line's always copied into the first copy of violin 1. Violin 2 says tacit in that movement, because violin 2 doesn't play, and the duplicate violin 2 also says tacit, because the player from that doesn't play. And it also says tacit in the duplicate copy of violin 1. Do you see the sense in which in that movement the duplicate copy isn't actually a duplicate? There's no point in writing out by hand, using up paper, ink, and copyist time, a line that you were just then going to have to tell the other player of violin 1, don't play this, right? This is a way in which violin 1 and its duplicate are sometimes different. This is different, by the way, with printed parts. It's much easier and cheaper to set up one part, mark the line solo, print 2 copies of it, which is no more expensive than printing 1 copy. Give them to the players and let the players work it out. Oh, it says solo, the first player will play it, the second player won't, right? But when you're copying these out by hand, the economics and the labor are very different. So, a situation in which violin 1 and its duplicate are actually slightly different. Maybe now you can guess what happened with Cantata 37 at the moment of dividing Bach's estate. In dividing the estate, somebody separated the parts from the score and grabbed 1 copy each of violin 1, violin 2, and basso continuo to send with the score, as usual. But they accidentally took the first copy of violin 1 and the first copy of violin 2 and sent them with the score, as it turns out, into oblivion, leaving us with only the duplicates, and the violin 1 part there lacks the obbligato, right? It's just an accident of the way the parts got divided. And you might say, well, how do we know that what we have is the duplicates? They're the ones in the hands, the ones we have are the ones in the hands of the junior copyists, right? Not one of the principal copyists. So we know that we accidentally have the duplicates and not the main set. Usually that wouldn't matter, they'd have the same notes laid out in the same way, but not in this case, we are missing the obbligato. And we know that there wasn't yet another instrument playing, some instrument that drops in and parachutes in just for this movement, because we've got the original contemporary wrapper for the parts in the hand of the principal copyist who listed all the instruments you need for the piece, and there's no other instruments listed, right? So this must be what happened. There must be a now lost violin 1 obbligato. Movement 2 is transmitted incompletely without its likely violin solo line. Okay, what do we do about this? Well, what we did about it was what you heard is a reconstruction. It's a newly composed obbligato based on a close knowledge of what Bach typically did in an aria like this. In particular, what the usual relationship is between the vocal line and the bass line, and especially the instrumental obbligato line. The version we heard was newly composed by Masato Suzuki, made for the Bach Collegium in Japan. You can hear it on their recording of his piece. Masato is the son of Masato Suzuki, the director of the Bach Collegium in Japan, and they were very kind to send us a copy of their version to use today. We're grateful for that. So maybe you agree this is a pretty long walk from that note in the program about movement 2, but I think it's worth it for what we can learn about this music and how, almost miraculously, it reaches us today. Thank you.